But the reality is that he didn't get to serve in the temple like others. And I think that's why it's so troubling when you see the two sons of Eli and how horribly they served God at the temple or at the tabernacle, that it just bothers you to no end. And here's this good man, Elkanah, who could have been a great servant at the tabernacle, could have been there, but he wasn't. And so it also speaks to us as fathers that we are the priests of our home, that we are the priests that God has established and to take care of our family and to raise them up to follow the Lord. He was obedient to the Lord all the way through. In chapter 2, verse 11, I'm going to skip over to a little bit. It says, Then Elkanah went to his house at Ramah, but the child ministered to the Lord before Eli the priest. So he left his son there. He left his only son through the woman he loved the most. Must have been a very difficult thing, but he was obedient. And that's what God calls all fathers to be, all men to be. And so even though he was a priest, and he was probably bivocational, like many priests are, a lot of pastors are that way, and he did not have the pleasure of being a full-time person, nonetheless, he fulfilled all the requirements of the law. Every year he went up. He was a good man. He was obedient to the Lord. But Elkanah left a legacy, didn't he? He was recognized as a faithful servant to the Lord, a husband to Hannah, a father to Samuel, and by many others, God had blessed him. And then he blessed him with more children later on. And we see that in chapter 2, verses 20 and 21. We're not going to go there. Well, let's go back to the first part of chapter 1, and we're going to talk about Elkanah, the worshiper. We've talked about him as a man, who he was as a person. We talked about him as a father. We've talked about him as a husband. And now we're going to lastly talk about him as a worshiper. So again, as I mentioned before, he was most likely a Levite, a very faithful worshiper of the Lord. And in verse 3, it says that this man went up from the city yearly to the worship and sacrifice to the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. So he went up there yearly, every year, to go do the sacrifices. Again, we don't see this anywhere else in the scriptures where it says that there was someone faithful in this manner to doing their daily sacrifices and following the Levitical law. Elkanah, Peninnah, and Hannah were one of those few families that did that. So in verse 19 it says, Then he rose early in the morning and worshipped before the Lord, and returned and came to their house at Ramah. And Elkanah knew Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. Throughout the story, the verb usage implies that Elkanah worships, and it was an ongoing yearly commitment. Every year he went. He was faithful in doing that. His dedication throughout this story indicates that he was no on-again and off-again Christian. He was a dedicated Christian. He went to the house of the Lord. He served faithfully. He obeyed the laws. He obeyed the Lord. Now, in verse 21, it says here, Now the man Elkanah and all his house went up to offer to the Lord the yearly sacrifice and his vow. So we think worship is a matter of the individual. But it's very interesting. Every single time it talks about Elkanah going up to worship, he's worshiping with his family. We are a church family here. We love the Lord as a family, as a church family. I'm not sure that we really are individuals worshiping him when it's being the best that we're supposed to do. I think we worship best when we're together. I think as a family, as a body of believers, that's what God really delights in. He delights in the worship of his people, not as individuals, as families, as a large family, as a church. That's what God's really wanting of us. And that's what Elkanah did, and demonstrate that throughout his life. He fulfilled his promises regardless of the difficulty, regardless of the fact that he couldn't be full-time. He was a part-time guy. I've been that way myself, been a part-time pastor in the past. And I've known what it was like. I enjoyed my ministry. And I think that Elkanah did too. He did the best that he could. There was a cost. There was probably even a little bit of a pain, especially when he goes up to the temple or to the tabernacle and he sees these two sons of Eli who are totally abusing their position. So let's look at that. Let's look at these two sons of Eli. Why is it even mentioned so early in this story when we don't hear about more of them until later? It says right here in verse 3, it says, And also the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, the priests of the Lord, were there. Why is that even part of the story? Why is it even mentioned? I think it's mentioned because later on we find out that these two rascals totally abused their power as priests and would go and take the best of the offering, and it was supposed to be dedicated to the Lord, and they would take of it to say it's their portion, and they would eat of it. So it was very clear to the Israelites. Elkanah, Hannah, and all the others, that these priests were taking advantage of it. And I mean, what power could they have over him? They couldn't tell him to stop. They were the priests. They were the priests of Eli. I mean, they were his sons. I mean, what more are you going to say to the number one dude? You're just not going to do that. And so here's Elkanah trying to worship and be obedient to the Lord, and he sees the abuse of these two men. It must have just broke his heart. And then to leave his son in the care of this man later on, he had to have been, oh my God, it must have just broke his heart. But he did so. He was obedient. The Lord said this is what he needed to do, and he did it. And that's sometimes as fathers, sometimes those are the hard things that we have to do, is we have to do things like this. We have to give up our children when it doesn't seem like it's right. But God has said, this is what I want you to do. So, here's the thing. Elkanah was a worshiper. He was obedient. That's what's most important about this story. The fact that he mentioned Hophni and Phinehas in the story goes to the point and tells more about who Elkanah was, not who these boys were. Because Samuel, later on, it seems like he mostly interacted with Eli. And then Eli raised him up to know about the Lord. But, I mean, even Eli had his issues. And you see that if you read later on in the book, you'll find out that Eli had a lot of issues. And Samuel was truly this good man that had been raised. But Samuel, for the first 7 or 8 years of his life, was raised by a obedient, godly man in the person of Elkanah. As I've been a children's pastor for many years, and I tell this many times, basically by the time you're 10, 11, 12 years old, who you are as a person is established. Whether or not you're going to go to church, whether or not you're going to be a good person, whether or not you're going to have a good work ethic, that's pretty much established by the time you turn to that just before your teenage years. So for 7 or 8 years, Elkanah and Hannah are raising Samuel obediently to love the Lord, which I think is the reason why he was able to be faithful to the Lord after his training with Eli. And so Samuel demonstrated over and over again that he was a good young man that loved the Lord. And even though there was the fault of Eli and his sons, Samuel continued to remain faithful to the Lord. And I think a large part of it goes back to Elkanah and Hannah. So I want to conclude with just these 3 thoughts. Despite our own faults. Now, Elkanah did have some issues. I mean, first of all, he did marry 2 wives. I mean, that caused a friction in the very beginning with his 2 wives. So some of the problems that he suffered through were of his own design. It was at fault. All of us men have that. We all do stupid things. I don't know why we do that, but we do. But you know what? This story is this great story of redemption. A great story of God's control and love of us. That everything is he's taking care of everything. He's got it into place. And despite all these issues, the Lord's going to even use the stupid things that we do to fulfill his plan. So even though Elkanah had something to do with the fault, the reality is he still responded in obedience to the Lord, didn't he? All the way through his life, he did that. The second thing is, despite our situation, we still must be obedient. Elkanah could have just raised a riot with those 2 boys and probably caused such an uproar in the community, but he probably realized nothing would have happened of it. Instead, he chose to be faithful to the Lord and do what he was supposed to do and raise up his family to love God too. That was his job. That's who he was as a person. That's what fathers are supposed to do. Lastly, Elkanah was a man. He was a real man. A real man is this. He's defined not by the things he does. He's defined by who he is in the Lord. He's defined by his spouse, the love that he has for his spouse. He's defined by the fact that he's a father and he's going to raise his children up to love the Lord. And he's defined by the fact that he's a worshiper. A lot of times men have a hard time singing in church. A lot of times men have other ways, but there's other ways in which men can worship. But I want to strongly encourage you as men that your family should see you worshiping the Lord. If that's quietly at your bedside praying, if that is with your hands lifted up in worship, if it's you out in the field and you're singing a song while you're doing work, your kids need to see that. Others need to see that. Your wife needs to see that. And God needs to see that. On this Father's Day, I'm asking you, all of us, including myself, I've struggled many times, believe me, let's be a man that loves God. Let's be a man that loves our wife. Let's be a man that loves our children. And let's be a man that worships the Lord and demonstrates to others how they can do it as well. God bless you. May you have a wonderful week. And spend this time this week. In fact, I have a little challenge for you. I want you, sometime this week, I want you to turn to your wife, and I want you to tell her how much you love her and appreciate her. Think about that day, that wedding day when you said, I do. I then want you to tell your children how much you are so appreciative of them. If you have to, like myself, you have to call, because my kids are spread all over the country. Call them up and tell them how much you love them and how much you appreciate them, and how much you wish that they just, all their life, will serve the Lord with everything that they have. Enjoy your Father's Day. God bless you.